The General Secretary of the CPSU Central Committee, Leonid Brezhnev, is classified as strictly secret. On the 4th of February, 1981st year, at 19 hours and 30 minutes, on Kirov Street in Moscow, in his official car, when an explosive device of the trap type was opened, camouflaged under a box of medicines and transmitted through employees. The explosion killed the chief designer of the Kuibyshev Design Bureau of Automatic Systems of the Ministry of Aviation Industry of the USSR, Igor Berezhnoi. Taking into account the identity of the deceased and the circumstances of his death, several investigative versions have been put forward and are being worked out in the case, including a terrorist act, sabotage, or other state crime. This incident is considered the first contract murder in the USSR. Today, not everyone knows the name of Igor Berezhny, but 40 years ago, he was a real star of the aerospace industry. He was the author of over 200 scientific developments in the field of aircraft engineering. The greatest fame to the designer was brought by the laser glide path aircraft landing system. Today, this unique development is used all over the world without an emergency landing of aircraft. In the 70s, it became a real breakthrough in aviation. But who could benefit from the death of the designer? After all, the murderers, the customer, apparently, have not been found in the scientists so far. I have a piece of evidence from the past in my hands. Excerpts from criminal case number 59. The investigators had it code-named Trap. Here, almost every witness statement is a separate version of what happened. Betrayal, bribery, theft of state property, espionage, a series of mysterious suicides of subordinates of Igor Berezhny. What was it? What secret were the employees of the secret bureau trying to hide? Who could really be behind the murder of the chief designer? What does foreign intelligence have to do with it? And how did it happen that Berezhny's death was the first in a series of mysterious deaths of the best Soviet gunsmiths? Today, new facts and details have emerged that will help shed light on this high-profile case. Let's figure it out. Revenge for Star Wars is on the program today. What secret development of the scientist was the CIA hunting for? The use of a laser can hit the enemy at long distances. The KGB is on the trail. What inconsistencies did the investigators find? Only a dedicated professional could make such a bomb in 1981. The shocking examination of the explosion is precisely designed for one who was behind this brutal crime. A particularly important witness, about what the only surviving eyewitness of the murder was silent for almost 40 years. Exclusive interview. He was terribly afraid of something, someone out there. Don't be so afraid of prison. So who announced the hunt for Soviet weapons scientists, and why it continued even after the collapse of the USSR? Stay tuned. An explosion in a car is an extraordinary event for the Soviet Union. The best forces of the KGB were thrown in search of the criminal. The investigator then will not be able to get on the trail of the killer. But none of them suspected that the way to solve this mysterious crime would appear only when our best scientists began to disappear in a strange way or die a violent death all over the world. Krasnoyarsk. Sergei Bakhvalev, head of the Department of Physical Chemistry of Krasnoyarsk State University, disappeared. His dismembered body was found 10 days later. Moscow. Sergei Bugayenko, Doctor of Technical Sciences, Professor, Director General of the International Center for Nuclear Safety, was killed. Washington, USA. Andrei Gorobets, a well-known nuclear physicist, was shot dead. Paris, France. Vladimir Arnold, a famous Russian mathematician, academician of the Russian Academy of Sciences, died under mysterious circumstances. Kuibyshев, Malta, killed Alexander Pikayev, a well-known Russian expert on nuclear disarmament. And this list can be continued for a very long time. More than 70 scientists were killed. That's when such scientists are simply taken and destroyed, as it were. This, in fact, I think, is quite a serious call. for the sake of which they deprived the lives of people who made the most important discoveries for the whole world. Today, we will combine all these murders into one record-keeping, but we will take as a starting point the mysterious death of Igor Berezhny, chief designer of the Kuibyshev Secret Design Bureau. Version 1. A terrorist attack. From the protocol of the interrogation of the driver Igor Berezhny Rashid, an hour before the tragedy, a box of medicines for the scientist was brought to the car by a man. He said that Igor Alexandrovich had forgotten it at the representative office. A sick mother was waiting for the chief designer in Kuibyshev. Many medicines for her could be found only in Moscow. Every time he went on a business trip, the scientist asked his colleagues to get the necessary medicines. Therefore, Berezhnoi, without hesitation, immediately threw the bundle next to him. The car started off on Ulansky Lane, but after driving only half a block, it stopped on Myasnitskaya Street, next to the reception of the Ministry of Defense. Heavy snow was falling, the wipers could not cope. The driver came out to wipe the windshield, carefully bent over the box, and began to open it. At the same moment, there was an explosion. The driver was thrown to the side. And here's the first question. Who gave the driver this box, and what did this person look like? Or maybe Rashid didn't get out of the car by accident. We will answer these questions a little later, but in the meantime, we will find out who exactly this bundle was intended for. The explosion is directed. It only kills this man, the chief designer, and the driver was almost not injured, a small concussion. In other words, in general, only a professional, and of the highest level, could make such a bomb in 1981 year. It was difficult to create it in some artisanal way. As it was later established during the investigation, there was an explosive device of the trap type in the box. But how did it work? How does it appear in the criminal case when opening the box? And what would have happened if he had done it a little later? Maybe the target of this trap was not the designer himself, but someone else. Berezhnoi on this day was supposed to meet with the highest ranks of the USSR at the airport right before departure. Maybe the calculation was on them, and the bomb just went off ahead of time. KGB officers immediately began to work out this seemingly incredible version. Let's follow in the footsteps of the investigators and also conduct an experiment. Let's simulate the situation. A car, a dummy, exactly the same explosive device. Let's see what kind of destructive power it will have. And let's answer the question, was this terrorist attack designed to destroy several people or just one? So, let's recreate the events of 1981 year. Andrei Popov, a veteran of the anti-terror Alpha Group, will help us. During the explosive examination, which was carried out by the Operational and Technical Directorate of the KGB of the USSR, it turned out that industrial ammonite was used as an explosive for the murder of Berezhny. This was determined by three parameters: the plaque in the cabin, the roughness of the blast wave coating, and soot on the scientist's belongings. This substance has been widely used and is currently being used, carrying out industrial developments in order to compact the soil, and in general, of course, it is much easier to get it than TNT. During the investigation, it was found that the improvised explosive device contained about 100 grams of TNT equivalent of explosives. For comparison, in the St. Petersburg Metro in the 2017 year, a bomb with a capacity of 3 times more was detonated. It claimed the lives of 16 people. So the protal equivalent of ammonite is 0.7. So, approximately, probably, about 350 grams of industrial honey was used to kill a Soviet scientist. Let's look at the explosion again. There is a very characteristic smell, respectively. We do not see this high explosive effect, at least I do not see it. And accordingly, we understand that the explosive device was shell-free, that is, we do not have traces of striking elements. And apparently, this saved the driver in the 81st year. Of course, there is no chance of a person with a disassembled improvised explosive device with the equivalent of 100 grams or even less, which is lying either on his knees or just holding it in his hands, he does not have. This is a huge explosive wave that strikes the internal organs. The spleen and liver are torn. The heart is being installed. The pressure jumps sharply. This is a blow to the eyes, to the eardrums. But what about the main question? Could a bomb of such power kill several people at once? If the damaging elements and the power of the charge were greater, then not only the scientist would have died, but also his driver, who was wiping the windshield at the time of the explosion, says our specialist. Accordingly, it is possible that the target of the terrorists, the attackers, were only a scientist. This expert opinion is, of course, subjective. Igor Berezhnoi could open the box at the moment when the driver was nearby. But one thing is clear, this charge was intended for the one who was supposed to open this box. It turns out that the version about the attempt to eliminate the highest ranks of the USSR is not consistent. The KGB officers also quickly abandoned it and immediately began to study Igor Berezhny's environment. And it was there that they found important clues. Naturally, professional activity is being worked out. What did this person do? To what extent was he, let's say, related to some kind of financial, maybe flow, right? Maybe some kind of secret. And the first one who started to work out was just Igor Berezhny's driver Rashid. Who gave him the box? What did this man look like? He could not give a clear answer to this question. They made a sketch, but there was no such employee in the Moscow representative office of the Kuibyshev Design Bureau. And the fact that Rashid got out of the car at the time of the explosion, was it luck or a tactical move? Maybe just before leaving the car, the driver suggested that Igor Berezhny examine the contents of the box. You never know what they forgot to put in it. After questioning the driver, Berezhny was released, despite the fact that at the time of the explosion, he left the car in order to wipe the snow on the windshield. He has not been charged with anything. This was due to the fact that there really was no evidence against him. I think it's a pure coincidence that Berezhny's driver left the car at the exact moment when Berezhny opened the box, and an explosion sounded. The next investigators were interested in Igor Berezhny's subordinates. The second version is the revenge of colleagues. The first inspections of the Kuibyshev Design Bureau of Automatic Systems revealed numerous thefts. On the 25th of August, 1981st year of the USSR Prosecutor's Office, a criminal case was initiated under the article Embezzlement of State Property on a particularly large scale. During the investigation, large embezzlement was discovered at that time. Embezzlement in the amount of 20,000 rubles. But in order to understand what 20,000 rubles is, at that time the engineer received 90 rubles. The older wife 110. The lead engineer received 220 rubles. I have another interesting piece of evidence in my hands. Remarks made by Nikolai Antipov, an investigator for particularly important cases of the USSR Prosecutor's Office. And here are his conclusions about the involvement of Igor Berezhny in embezzlement. The actions of the chief designer of the Design Bureau contain signs of a crime under Article 92, Part 2 of the Criminal Code of the USSR. Theft of state or public property committed by theft. There is also a note here. The criminal case against Igor Berezhny should be terminated in connection with the death of the latter. The investigation found that several other people were involved in financial fraud. The head of the technical department of the Design Bureau, Gennady Naris, his deputy Vladimir Nikoroshev, photographer of the same department, Mikhail Sigankov, and the head of the Special Technical Bureau in Moscow, Solomon Barenstein. And all of them were allegedly covered by Igor Berezhnoi himself. But could a prominent scientist actually support such machinations? An arrest warrant was issued for each of these people, but not all of them had time to testify. For example, photographer Mikhail Sigankov committed suicide right before his arrest by drinking a lethal dose of dichloroethane. During the arrest, Gennady Naras also tried to take his own life, but he was promptly taken to the hospital, where his life was saved. From the memoirs of the investigator on particularly important cases, Nikolai Antipov, Gennady Naros was detained on the 21st of July, 1982nd year. Right during the interrogation, when the guards entered, Naros rushed to his briefcase, took out a knife, and stabbed himself in the stomach. A second later, he was lying on the floor, blood gushing from the wound. Mikhail Sigankov was summoned for questioning on August 20, 1982. According to the testimony, before going into the investigator's office, he gulped down the liquid from the bottle. As it was later established by the label of the discarded bottle, there was dichlorine inside there. During the interrogation, Sigankov behaved strangely, answered questions confusedly, then began to choke, asked to open the window, and after an hour and 20 lost consciousness. As doctors later found out, he fell into a coma, as a result of which all internal organs failed one by one, and death occurred. But why did Igor Berezhny's subordinates try to take their own lives during the arrest? Were they afraid to testify? What secrets were kept by the inner circle of the famous scientist, which turned out to be more important than their own lives? Or could they have been involved in the death of the chief? Perhaps the only surviving witness of those events, the deputy head of the technical department of the Design Bureau, Vladimir Nikoroshev, will help answer this question. He also went through this high-profile case and, as a suspect, received a suspended sentence as a result. He still remembers the day when it became known about the murder of Igor Berezhny. He also saw a colleague, photographer Mikhail Sigankov, just a few days before his suicide. After the arrest of Not Rosie, he was terribly afraid of someone there. Well, even now I do not know how not to be afraid of prison, probably as he was afraid of something. In this case, and for the worst, there are many mysteries left. Yes, they used the property of the Design Bureau outside of the Design Bureau itself. For example, they shot not only tests of their own equipment on imported film, but also films about veterans of their city, commissioned by the local administration. But the scientist is sure that these events have nothing to do with the plunder. So did Igor have a careful attitude to embezzlement or not? And who, and most importantly, why did it take to eliminate him if he was in business? Maybe one of the scientist's associates was very offended by him to such an extent that he decided to remove it. Employees of the State Security Committee soon managed to identify a suspect in the commission of this monstrous murder. The resolution of the investigative department of the KGB of the USSR of January 30th, 1984 says this. It was established that the improvised explosive device was handed over to Berezhny through other persons by the head of the technical department of the Design Bureau, Gennady Naras, who admitted that he had committed a crime on domestic grounds. In this regard, he was charged with premeditated murder under aggravating circumstances. But why didn't Rosa, a classmate of Berezhnoi, who raised more than one design bureau with him, want to settle accounts with his friend and boss, and even in such a sophisticated way that they could not share? From the protocol of the interrogation of witness Vladimir Komogorov, dated June 25, 1983, Kuibyshev, the man knew Gennady Naros from working together. The relationship between them was normal, without personal accounts and enmity. At the time of his employment in the Design Bureau, Naros was already working as the head of the technical department. Then, according to rumors, he was carried away by Igor Berezhny in frauds related to the purchase and incorrect write-off of material values, for which he was, on the oral instructions of the chief designer of the demoted position and appointed director of the pioneer camp under construction. So could the scientist really have been killed by his closest associate? On the one hand, there is a motive and some more. After all, a person involved in state secrets, demoted to the post of director of a pioneer camp, could harbor not just a grudge, but a desire for revenge. A friend who became an enemy. But could he have organized such a complex murder alone? Probably not. Or maybe he was helped by Mikhail Sigankov, who was poisoned with dichloroethane. What were they so afraid of that they were ready to give up their lives? Or these people were just performers, pawns in someone's big game. But if that's the case, then who could be standing behind them? And who really needed to get the chief designer of the Kuibyshev Secret Design Bureau out of the way? It would seem that the murder investigation was almost completed. The criminal has been identified. Now we need to settle only some formalities and take the case to court. However, on November 12, 1984, the USSR Prosecutor's Office issued a resolution to terminate this criminal case due to the lack of proof of the charges brought against Gennady Nerosa. But he still received a punishment for embezzlement, 10 years in a high-security colony. It turns out that Berezhny's closest associate still had nothing to do with it. Or did the investigators not look at something? Another interesting point. Shortly after his release, the former head of the technical department of the Design Bureau went missing under uncertain circumstances. His whereabouts are still unknown. So who are they, Igor Berezhny's associates? Victims or accomplices? Maybe they were removed in the same way as the head of the Design Bureau. But why? The only survivor of this high-profile case, Vladimir Nikoroshev, has no doubt that Igor Berezhny was killed because of his professional activities. Allegedly, the laser courses of the glide path system, which was developed by the Design Bureau of Igor Alexandrovich, were very interested from abroad. Naturally, this development could be of interest to Americans. They could find approaches to him not directly through their agents recruited by someone. 1980, Kuibyshev. A delegation of American aviation industry specialists arrived to study the work of the glide path. Even in front of the lenses of Soviet photographers, they do not hide their admiration when they see the system in action. And without end, they shake hands with its creator, the chief designer, then whisper something in his ear. Vladimir Nikoroshev attended these demonstration tests as a photographer, and personally heard how the Americans offered Igor careful cooperation. Well, there it was in this form, would you like, in cooperation with the United States, that is, with us, to continue all this work on a different technical basis, more in different climatic conditions. Then I heard talk that it was already a private continuation, this conversation. He was offered a job, yes. It turns out that they wanted to lure the scientists to work in the USA. Or did you want to recruit? Then in the program, they are connected by one chain. Why have the death cases of the most prominent scientists still not been solved? In the 2002 year, in 6 months, only about 6 people were killed by a scientist. The blast wave, for which, in fact, Igor Berezhny paid with his life. A high-power laser beam, it also hits warheads. It is classified what unique documents our program managed to find. We have conducted a special investigation, and its results are shocking. We can also see maps. We can see the distance of the description of objects, buildings, and everything that is in this complex. So who is killing Soviet and now Russian scientists, and most importantly, why? Igor Berezhnoi headed the secret Kuibyshev Design Bureau of Automatic Systems since 1972. As specialist, he was appreciated by such aircraft designers as Andrei Tupolev, Oleg Antonov, and Vladimir Musishev. The laser glide path system, which he developed, became the countdown of a new time in the world of aviation. The glide path system of the course is a radio navigation system for the approach of aircraft by instruments. How does it work? It forms a picture of 3 luminous rays in the pilot's field of view, 2 of which form the plane of the glide path for lowering the aircraft, and the 3rd ray indicates the direction of the landing course. The pilot's task is to keep the aircraft within the glide corridor between the side beams, strictly above the heading beam. This ensures that the aircraft hits the runway, even if it is not visible. An experimental sample of a new aircraft landing system, a laser glide path, was developed under the leadership of Igor Berezhny back in 1974-78 years. In the 2004, it was improved and renamed the Glide Path M. This unique system allows you to land an aircraft in conditions of the most poor visibility at dusk, at night, in foggy haze, in very bad weather. The use of a laser, in addition to the fact that it can be both a target pointer and an assistant when landing aircraft. Of course, if it attracts power, it becomes a very effective weapon, quiet, silent, powerful, and which can hit the enemy at long distances in the future. The only question is the beam power. And this, according to experts, is not the only development that could be of interest to foreigners. At the end of the 60s, joint research was actively conducted in the United States and Canada to create a hovercraft takeoff and landing system to increase the mobility of military transport aviation. The same takeoff and landing device was developed in the Kuibyshev Design Bureau. The Un-14, designed by Oleg Antonov, was chosen for the experiments, which subsequently gave Igor Berezhny the authority to independently make changes to the aerodynamics and strength of the aircraft. And already in 1971 year, flight tests with an air cushion landing gear were completed, a year earlier than in the USA. Also, under the leadership of Berezhny, the most complex chassis design for a supersonic aircraft, designed by Pavel Sukhoi, was developed. The aircraft was ahead of the American equivalent of the B-1 by 10 years. In other words, the USSR was constantly moving several steps ahead of the United States. Could they really have turned a blind eye to this at the height of the Cold War? Of course, they were also afraid of Russia's breakthrough in this direction, that is, that Russia would have superiority. And accordingly, of course, they wanted to get, well, of course, you can first of all have some of the developments that Berezhny had. And here it is worth telling about another strange murder. Valentin Safronov, an employee of the Design Bureau and an associate of Berezhny, who after the murder of Igor Alexandrovich, went to Moscow to the ministry and was found hanged. He left the request and did not arrive at the representative office and disappeared altogether. And then his body was found in the technical room of some kind of subway, I can't say which one. A strangulation furrow was found on Safronov's neck. A specific sign of death, or an attempt to cause it from hanging and strangulation with a noose, is precisely the strangulation furrow. It is she who is the very mark from the compression of the neck with a noose. It is not known whether the investigators paid attention to this detail and what conclusions they came to. This case is also classified, as is the professional activity of the murdered man. From closed sources, we managed to find out that Valentin Safronov was developing a laser cannon with nuclear pumping to neutralize satellites. In the area of Lake Balkhash, it was planned to build a ground-based laser anti-satellite shield. If so, it turns out that Safronov could have been eliminated in order to prevent the implementation of these plans. However, as well as Igor Berezhny himself, his supervisor. And in the field of interests of the killers, there could be not a laser landing system of aircraft, but a more large-scale and significant development. Interestingly, similar studies are being conducted in America at the same time. A little later, they will be combined into one program, which will be called Star Wars. It will be announced by Ronald Reagan in 1983, almost immediately after the strange sequence of all the deaths of our scientists. A coincidence. And here is another very interesting point. This is a European newspaper. Here, the Soviet designer is called a man from the future. Indeed, according to Vladimir Nikoroshi, the Kuibyshev Design Bureau was engaged in secret developments related not only to aviation, but also to space. The benefit of pieces that practically extinguishes all the electronics of satellites and makes it just a piece of iron. A high-power laser beam, it almost hits both the warheads and, let's say, the aircraft's navigation system. And now attention, a clue that might help explain a lot. These documents were released due to information leaks. Langley's so-called secret list. It includes people whose activities are allegedly monitored by the CIA. Here are the names of Russian leading designers and military engineers. For example, here, a scientist from the Russian Federal Nuclear Center in Serov, former Arzama-16. These are the developers of nuclear charges for the Bulava poplars and specialists in laser thermonuclear fusion. Of course, we will not name the names of these people for poetic reasons. They are alive, healthy, and still working. Igor Berezhnoi was on the same list. It turns out that a real hunt has been announced for our scientists. Or is this document a fake? To find out, we will conduct an examination for authenticity. Alexander Volovic, an internet technology specialist, will help us make it. We find the repository of this document, and a real sensation awaits us. We have a CIA base in front of us. In January 2017, the CIA published a series of documents about its activities in relation to the Soviet Union, from 1940 to 1990. At first, they did it formally, gave access to 4 computers in their office. Then the court decided that it was necessary to open this access to everyone. It turns out that this list is authentic. And right there we find several more documents concerning the Design Bureau and its head. Here's a look, a detailed description of the glide path. This system itself is described, that the Russians have a new landing system, and that this is a strong enough threat. They have known since 1979 year, 2 years later, the scientist who developed this laser landing system was killed. And this is information about Igor Berezhny himself. The list and his last name. It says here that they've been following him since 1966, a few years before he invented this airplane landing system. We cannot say that the CIA has anything to do with Igor Berezhny's death. The fact that our scientist has been in their field of vision for a long time, and they have been monitoring his activities, is now an indisputable fact. But the deaths continue. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, news about the murders of Russian scientists will come one after another. In the 90s, in general, the bill will go not for dozens, but for hundreds of such cases. Scientists in those years were constantly invited to move to the United States, and those who refused to cooperate die under very strange circumstances. Moscow. The victim was Igor Glebov, director of the St. Petersburg Research Institute of Mechanical Engineering. Ildar Mamedov, one of the most famous scientists in the field of protection against psychotronic weapons. Vyacheslav Fedorov, professor, Faculty of Computational Mathematics and Cybernetics, Moscow State University. Sergei Vovk, Doctor of Technical Sciences, laureate of the State Prize, was poisoned. St. Petersburg. An attempt was made on the famous designer of nuclear submarines, Director General of the Central Design Bureau Rubin, Evgeny Goriglygin. Togliatti. Vyacheslav Salikov, a famous aircraft manufacturer, was killed. In June 2000 of the 10th year, a Russian expert on nuclear disarmament, Alexander Pikayev, was killed in the city of Bujiba in Malta. The local authorities tried to present this incident as an accident. But here's the evidence. The Times of Malta newspaper. Here, in the crime section, it is written in black and white. A mark from a blow was visible on the head of the deceased Russian scientist. And here is one more detail, the protocol of inspection of the scene by police officers. It says that when Pikayev's body was found, his computer was still working, but all data from it was deleted. At the same time, nothing was missing from the scientist's apartment. But the specialists could not restore the files. On the 20th of June, 2000 of the 11th year, a Tu-134 crashed near the village of Bisovets. In the Onega district in Karelia, representatives of 3 nuclear companies were on board. Almost the entire leadership of the Oak Gidropress, part of the state concern Rosatom, was killed. The Tu-134 was flown by the general designer of the Design Bureau Sergei Rizov, deputy director of the company Gennady Banyuk, chief designer Nikolai Trunov. In addition, Andrei Trofimov, chief technologist of the Afrikantov Experimental Design Bureau of Mechanical Engineering, and Valery Lyabin, head of the Atom Energomash department, were killed when the plane crashed. They were all flying to a meeting that was to be held in Petrozavodsk, Masha. The plane crashes, killing 5 people who were flying to the most important conference. And some of them worked with Iran on the construction of a nuclear power plant in Bushehr. And it was during this period that we know that the Americans were actively removing Iranian nuclear scientists. It is the oldest daily Israeli Haaretz building. Immediately after the crash of the Tu-134, his journalists started talking about the conspiracy theory. In their opinion, the plane crash was planned and executed by the special services. The target of the terrorist attack was Russian specialists who helped Iran develop its nuclear program. So is the hunt for scientists, about whom so much was written in the 90s, still going on. Former US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who continues to play an important political role, made a shocking statement in 2000. The existence of science in states unfriendly to the United States is seen as a strategic threat to the United States. So can all these strange deaths of scientists be called accidental? Rather no than yes. They look too much like a very well-developed plan that could be aimed at ensuring that Russia does not win the race for advanced science and high technology. Igor Berezhnoi, Andrei Gorobets, Nikolai Ternov, and many others. Under mysterious circumstances, more than 70 scientists died. At first glance, the deaths of these scientists are in no way connected with each other. But this is only at first glance. And if you start to understand, it turns out that all these events have a lot in common. But most importantly, crimes were committed against our leading inventors who were engaged in the development of the latest systems, including for the military industry. So maybe it's time to officially investigate these cases anew and find those who are actually behind these crimes. You had the evidence program from the past with you. See you in a week.